Hey everybody, how you doing? Well, it's Sunday, May 31st, and it's time for me to record my May reading wrap-up. I read 6 novels this month and a handful of short stories or novelettes, and many of them I've already talked about on this channel in some of my horror mayhem reading updates. I started off the month by reading this very first trade paperback of Hellboy, The Seed of Destruction, which focuses on Hellboy's kind of origin and being called forth by Rasputin, the Mad Monk, and his Nazi allies, kind of going back in between the World War II era and the present day, or at least the present day when this was written. I enjoyed this very much, and I talked about it at greater length in a video, which I'll link to down below. In that same video, I also talked about At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft, one of his few novels. This one set in Antarctica and involving ill-fated expedition there to supposedly do some scientific research and geological research, and instead they find an ancient city, still inhabited perhaps by some creatures, some spectral eldritch horrors from another world, another realm. Very interesting book, a little different than the usual Lovecraft in some ways, in that it has kind of a more prosaic, realistic beginning point anyway, but it lapses definitely into his very, the Lovecraft's typical kind of rich language and eloquent description of things unknowable. I reviewed this book as well in more detail in that same video. I'm not going to spend much time on it here other than to say I really enjoyed both of them, and this one was a very interesting read. In that same video, I talked about some stories I read out of this volume, Atomic Werewolves and Man-Eating Plants. I read, in fact, the Man-Eating Plants story. I read Trapped by a Man-Eating Tree, The Werewolf and the Cowboy, and Strange Cult of the Vampire Tarantulas. I read all 3 stories out of this volume, which is edited and beautifully put together by Robert Dice and Wyatt Doyle. All those were talked about in one video for a Horror Mayhem Week 1 update. So please check that out for my more detailed thoughts about those stories and books. I took a few breaks here and there through the month away from horror and to read some other stuff, and one of those things that I read was The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Very famous and well-known fantasy novel. Written more for children, this one, although it's easily read as an adult and enjoyed, I would say. And I had read this one years and years ago, but it's been decades since. Tim at Secret Fire Books started in May this Tolkien read-along, Lord of the Ring read-along, starting with The Hobbit, and several other viewers and booktubers have been joining in reading The Hobbit, and some of them have talked about this book already, including Tim at Secret Fire Books and Chris at Liminal Spaces. I will link their videos below because they'll be much more eloquent about this book than I will be. I'll just say that I was happy to read this one as part of that read-along. I've been meaning to get to this one again. It's been a long time since I've read it, like I said, and boy, is it a good book. I really, really enjoyed it. It's got a really fun, authorly voice from Tolkien, like he's telling a tale, you know, smoking his pipe, sitting in the corner of a pub, or relating it in front of the fire from his comfortable leather armchair. A very interesting, fun book that starts off more lighthearted and gets a little bit more serious as it goes along. Just chock full of adventure and cool fantasy elements as Bilbo Baggins, a seemingly mild-mannered and unadventurous hobbit, is pulled along by the wizard Gandalf the Grey and a series of dwarves to accompany them on a quest. He's employed as a burglar, which of course he has no experience of, but proves to be quite good at. And essentially it's kind of a tale that shows how this kind of homebody of a hobbit turns out to be much more resourceful and brave than he would have imagined himself to be, and all the adventures he has with these various dwarf companions encountering menacing spiders and trolls and the cunning dragon Smaug and wood elves and all manner of creatures. Gollum, of course, and its very splendid Riddle in the Dark chapter. When Bilbo first comes into possession of the famed ring that Gollum has, there's no real hint of its true power and kind of evil influence in this book. It's just strictly a ring that renders Bilbo invisible, which turns out to be extremely lucky in several adventures and predicaments and escapes that Bilbo is part of in this book. Anyway, it's just beautifully written, just great pace, so much stuff happening, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful book, delightful. I recommend it to readers of all ages, especially those who maybe haven't read much fantasy. If you don't get into this fantasy novel, I don't know what will work for you. The genre might just not be for you. But many people know this book maybe from the Peter Jackson movies. Now, I'm a big fan of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy of movies. The Hobbit movies, less so. They have their good points, but they stretch this 300 and some page book. They stretch this book, Jackson and his team stretch this book into 3 movies and add a bunch of stuff that doesn't need to be in there. I have heard that there's a well done 4-hour edit of the 3 Hobbit movies I'd like to check out someday. It's available online, but I'm not that fussed about it, frankly, because the book is so good. It stands by itself. So for more detailed reviews, I'll direct you to Tim at Secret Fire Books or Chris at Liminal Spaces, who both do a fantastic job covering the various merits of this wonderful read. But just suffice it to say, I was really happy to get reacquainted with Bilbo and company in this book. Now, whether I'll continue with the read along through June, July, August, and for the Silmarillion, for the brave souls that will try that one in September, I don't know. I read the original novelette, Who Goes There, by John W. Campbell, which is the origin story of the various movies made about The Thing, 1951's Thing from Another World. Of course, the John Carpenter horror masterpiece, The Thing, in 1982. There was another Thing prequel made in the 2000s some point. I haven't bothered with that one because why would you need another movie after those first 2? But anyway, the original story was very cool, and I was happy to become acquainted with it finally at long last. John W. Campbell was, under the editorship of Astounding Science Fiction Pulp magazine at the time. He published this story in its pages under the pseudonym Donald A. Stewart. And it's a cracking read, highly recommended, very tense and claustrophobic with a vividly rendered Antarctic setting. I talked about this story and several others, which I'll soon mention in another video, Horror Mayhem Week 2 update, which I will link below as well in the description. Along the same time I was reading that, I also finished off a couple of stories by H.G. Wells from this lovely little Fontana collection of Wells's short horror fiction. I read The Valley of Spiders, the titular story, which was really creepy and interesting, and I also read a very good haunted house story or haunted room story called The Red Room. I talk about those in more detail in that same video with Who Goes There. I also read a tropical horror in this edition, The Masters of Terror Volume 1, William Hope Hodgson, a Corgi book, which has several cool stories in it. And I read the tropical horror, which is a nifty and very gnarly sea serpent attacking a merchant sailing vessel story. Very cool and pretty gruesome and scary. I enjoyed that one a lot too. Then again, taking another break kind of from horror, I read a book that Nick at the Book Graveyard had sent me last year, and it is The Chinese Lake Murders, a Judge D mystery. Now, I believe this is the 5th, if I recall, in the series of Judge D mysteries. Now, Judge D was a magistrate and apparently maybe a real figure that the scholarly and enterprising Dutchman Robert van Gulik, the author, took inspiration from his earlier tales that he found in some of his research into Chinese culture. He was a big fan and big scholar of ancient China, and also, Ming Dynasty, and also more recent time, 18th and 17th century China. From what I've read, there's a good introduction in this novel about him by Donald F. Locke. This is a very cool University of Chicago Press edition. It's another one that has the heavier binding and pages. I like a lot of the mystery books that have come out like this. I talked about some other ones previously on this channel, but this one is really interesting. So at this time, it's set in ancient China, and very turbulent time with politically, lots of there had been a White Lotus revolution apparently at this time, and we follow it seems to be in his 40s maybe, Judge D. He has several wives and children that we hear hints of but never really see in this novel. This book was originally published in 1960, but this University of Chicago edition is from 1977. It's got this nice, very dense and detailed map of the village where Judge D finds himself now. He's been put in charge of this community near this lake, and he senses, he's been there for a couple months when we open the book, and he senses that something's not right, that something's going on under his nose that is suspicious, and he can't quite put his finger on it. He's a very astute fellow, and of course, like a lot of good mystery books, mystery series from that time, we have a list of dramatis personae here. See, dramatis personae. And we meet here, and also throughout the pages of the book, some very enterprising young men, some of them of former criminal status, that are very keen and loyal assistants to Judge D and carry out many kind of perilous tasks for him in investigating the various crimes and conspiracies that he's involved in here. Judge D's, and it's Jin J D. He's the magistrate of Hanyuan, a small mountain district 60 miles west of the capital, referred to as Judge D or the Judge. And we have Liang Hung, referred to as Sergeant Hung or the Sergeant, Judge D's trusted advisor and sergeant of the tribunal. We have Ma Jung and Qiao Tai, who are first and second lieutenants, and these are two ruffians, two brigands that Judge D had met in the past and brought them into his service, and they're wily and tough assistants. And he gets a new assistant in this book about halfway through, or not quite halfway through, who proves to be extremely useful and resourceful, and he's kind of a gambler and bamboozler. Judge D saves him from a lynching. He becomes a trusted member of Judge D's team. His name is Gan Tao, and he has lots of knowledge of the underworld, and together these guys all work to help Judge D in his cases, although Judge D himself is extremely smart, adept, clever. He's a master swordsman, as well as having some fighting ability as well, and there are some fights and action in this. It's very cool. Pardon me, anyone who speaks Chinese fluently, any Chinese viewers watching this, for my mangling of the names. So all of these local wealthy citizens, or kind of leading citizens of this community, invite Judge D to a kind of nighttime cruise on the lake on this kind of floating barge or ship that's rowed by several oarsmen, and there's even a map of the barge because a murder takes place upon it, and they even kind of show the quarters and where everyone was supposedly at the time of the crime. Essentially, they're giving a kind of banquet and fete to kind of welcome this judge, even though he can tell there's lots of undercurrents of what's going on there. And there are several courtesans that are on board, kind of basically the equivalent of geisha, I suppose, in Chinese. They're essentially they're not prostitutes. They can take lovers, but they are mostly kind of skilled at serving men and laughing at their jokes and etc. And one of them is murdered. She's a beautiful woman who has a mysterious past and a kind of a haughty demeanor, but her name is Almond Blossom, and she does a very sexy dance. This book is earthy and involves some obvious sexual elements occasionally, as all murder plots probably have that involved in them to some extent. But anyway, she does this very enchanting dance, but shortly before that, when she was serving food to Judge D, she whispers to him that she has something to tell him important about a conspiracy afoot. And then shortly after her dance, she is murdered. Judge D finds her floating, drowned underneath. She was obviously, her body had been weighted so that she would drown and never be seen again, deep under the waters of the lake. But by some happenstance, the murderer took off because it was under a strict time constraint, and one part of her garment got attached to some piece of the ship that was protruding out, and Judge D finds her with her face floating up. And again, other than bemoaning the fact that this beautiful and mysterious woman has been murdered, strangled, he immediately shuts down the ship and starts his investigation, and his men are aboard, and they start looking into things and talking to the various crew members, who he quickly rules out as being involved. And that means someone on this ship, one of these leading wealthy citizens of this mountain district city, is the killer. And why did he kill this woman? What was that about? Was it because she was trying to tell something to Judge D? Was she connected some other way to this conspiracy? And eventually some more bodies crop up and more people go missing. All sorts of exciting, adventurous, tricky, sneaky, revelations come out as the book goes through. This is a wonderfully fun and enjoyable novel, very well written by Mr. Van Gulik. I read it in a single day. I was so entranced by it, and I was really glad I did, because I've known about the Judge D murder mystery series for a long time, and I've had several of the books in my collection for a long time, but I had yet to get around to reading any of them. So I finally did, thanks to Nick having sent me this one and the timing being just right. That's why I believe in having a big collection of books, many of which I haven't read, because you just never know when a certain book that you haven't read yet is going to speak to you. It could be years and years on your shelf, and then one day, bam, it's the right one at the right time for you. I enjoyed this one immensely, and I will read further books in this series very soon. Well, after reading Judge D, I got back into reading several issues a day to polish off the first collection of Kamandi, the Last Boy on Earth by Jack Kirby, written and illustrated by Jack Kirby. I found that there were editions of this, Kindle editions, available for free on Kindle Unlimited here in Japan. So I joined that briefly. I read the first 20 issues, and highly enjoyed it. Again, it's not groundbreaking. It's just fun. It's just kind of lively, fun, page-turning adventure stuff. Basically, DC wanted to put out a Planet of the Apes comic, but they didn't have the rights, so they asked Kirby to come up with something similar, and he posited a far future post-apocalyptic Earth where the various zoo animals got out and mutated into tiger men and lion men and gorilla men and leopard men and all kinds of different mutated creatures, as well as some mutated humans, as well, and also a lot of humans that are treated much like in the Planet of the Apes movies as kind of chattel, kind of unintelligent or low intelligent primitive tribes people that are used as slaves by a lot of these sentient animal humanoids. And Kamandi, getting his name from Kamandi, he comes out of this bunker when his grandfather passes away. He's watched a bunch of films of his people's past, and he's intelligent and able to use weapons, and just like a regular kind of 17, 18-year-old boy. And he goes out and has several adventures. He has a very distinctive crown of blonde hair and runs around in his shorts and gets involved in all sorts of adventures. He's not the smartest tool in the shed in some regards. He's kind of hot-headed and makes some kind of wrong decisions here and there. his heart's in the right place, and he's a tough fighter, and he's able to make friends with some of these beast people that become influential later on, and runs through several adventures, encountering all kinds of monsters and meeting some, a couple of attractive twin sisters. One's named Flower. He gets involved in all sorts of weird underground cities and leftover remnants of the past pre-apocalypse world, and very cool goings on. Again, they don't amount to much of any depth, of course. They're just a lot of fun things going from one adventure to another, very episodic. Some of the adventures stretch over 2 or 3 issues, and some are just contained in one issue. But overall, it's a lot of fun. It's something that the 13-year-old of Jeff would have eaten up with a spoon and declared the best thing ever written. But the 58-year-old Jeff really enjoyed it too. After that, I read a couple of creepy, blood-curdling tales out of this: Strange Beasts and Unnatural Monsters, 13 great stories of the macabre, or macabre, if you like. I always say macabre. But these are mostly animal or beast-related stories. They include stories by H.G. Wells, Arthur Conan Doyle, Ray Bradbury, and Daphne du Maurier. Last year's Horror Mayhem 2025, I read The Birds, Daphne du Maurier's The Birds, the original story that inspired the Hitchcock movie, the famous Alfred Hitchcock movie, which is great too, although very different from du Maurier's original novelette. This year, I only read 2 stories out of here. I read first, from later in the book, I read The Kill by Peter Fleming, and the contents page gives some interesting little snippets or little quotes from the stories, right? Whatever did it was more powerful and cunning than a dog. Their throats had been torn out. Now, this turns out to be kind of a werewolf story, but it's a very interesting story. Basically, 2 men are sitting in a kind of remote train station, little station house, waiting for the train to arrive. It's very cold outside. They're sitting by the fire. The younger man is more jocular and trying to start a conversation with the other older man, who seems a little more mysterious and not wanting to communicate much other than in kind of monosyllabic answers. And so out of straight boredom, basically, and kind of a perverse sense of goading the other into having to listen to him, the younger man tells a tale of his uncle, who was, originally going to leave a fair amount of his estate to this young man narrating the story, but some other circumstances got in the way, and what leads to is a kind of cursed revenge story involving lycanthropy of a sort. So very interesting tale. Probably overwritten. Peter Fleming is a good writer, but he's probably a little overly verbose than is necessary for this story. But still, an effective tale with a good shock ending, although you can see it coming if you're a veteran reader of horror tales. The other story I read from earlier in this book, I read it second though, and that is Doomsday Deferred by Will F. Jenkins. When I was reading the story and I was thinking, Will F. Jenkins, where have I heard that name before? He sounds familiar. Well, there's a reason why he sounds familiar. That is the real name of the science fiction author who wrote mostly under the name Murray Leinster. It's tons and tons of novels and stories. And this was a real treat to read, and it was stripped down and witty prose compared to the Peter James story. This one was a real smoothly written and, much more clipped and clear compared to the rather ornate Peter Fleming story that I mentioned before, The Killing. This one is really good and quite creepy in its implications. And this Doomsday Deferred is referring to some creatures or maybe an intelligence down in the Brazilian rainforest. The narrator talks about a expedition he undertook to find some remote, I think they're butterfly larvae, butterflies that fetch a high price at the time amongst these dealers in Lepidoptery. And he goes down and he is approached by a man. He's in this remote village in the Amazon, somewhere along the Amazon in the rainforest, and this rather disheveled young man approaches him. That young man is Jose Ribiera, and he looks very distraught, and he needs cash quickly, and he puts a sack of diamonds, a little bag of diamonds, priceless diamonds, down to the narrator and says, "Can you buy cattle with this? And I need some cattle right away." And the narrator's like, I don't want your diamonds. I'm here looking for these, these rare butterflies. And then eventually the man in desperation, Jose, says, "If I bring you the little round versions, he doesn't know what the word larvae is, but he knows what, that they're the baby versions of what these eventual butterfly will be." And he says, "If I bring you these, will you buy me some cattle?" And the narrator is like, "Well, those are almost impossible to find. There's no way you'll do it. But hey, yeah, if you do, I'll for sure take care of cattle for you." So before you know it, Jose comes back with a whole bunch of these, and the narrator of the story is dumbstruck and just can't believe it. So he quickly gets some cattle order, but they're on the way to the man, and Jose seemed extremely frightened and terror-stricken, and it's the fact that he came up with in such a quick time these larvae intrigues the narrator, and he goes out to visit, and he brings a pig as a present to Jose's family, and he finds Jose and Jose's wife and a young child, but the child seems normal, but the wife is young and attractive, but also extremely petrified, and the narrator can just tell there's some force watching him from the trees, and what is watching him, he eventually finds out, is army ants, but the army ants are being controlled by something, or is it all of them working together? And as he quickly gets the hell out of there, as he senses he better, otherwise he's in deep doo-doo, he hears the terrible screaming of the pig as it's being devoured by the ants, you assume. And that's the kind of end of the story, as the narrator speculates what might be humanity's doomsday deferred for the moment, if this force ever decides to move on from where it is. It's quite a creepy story, extremely well done. I haven't read this kind of story from Murray Leinster before, so it's very interesting, very fun. Again, this edition is a Fawcett book, a Fawcett Crest book, and it was published, it's selected with an introduction by Philip Van Doren Stern, and this was published in 1968, Strange Beasts and Unnatural Monsters. And it's got a little piece clipped off from the front of the cover, unfortunately, and a sticker I have yet to remove, but had this edition for a while, picked up at a used bookstore back in my hometown area quite a while ago, and it's packed full of really cool stories. It's also got The Terror of Blue John Gap, which is a great story by Arthur Conan Doyle. It's got Apiornis Island by H.G. Wells. Sorry for the pronunciation problem there. The Birds, as I mentioned before. The Judge's House by Bram Stoker. Mrs. Amworth by E.F. Benson. Skeleton by Ray Bradbury. The Elephant Man by Sir Frederick Treves. Slime by Joseph Payne Brennan, which I believe appeared in Weird Tales, but I could be mistaken there. The Nature of the Evidence by May Sinclair. The Garden of Paris by Eric William. And The Cocoon by John B.L. Goodwin. So lots of creepy crawlies in this thing. That was the last of my short horror reading, but I did get another short horror novel read, and that is Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. I just recently posted a deep dive into this book, as well as the 3 movies that were made from it, based on it. This book by Richard Matheson was published in 1954. This is a 1964 Bantam edition, and boy, was this a terrific read. Very intense. I was very familiar with the general outline of the story from the movies that I'd seen many times, especially the Omega Man, the 1971 Charlton Heston version, which is the least like this book's overall plot and story, but has some elements that were still true to it. Anyway, really short, sharp, nasty, dark, grim, and gripping read. I talked about it in detail in that other video that I mentioned, and I will link that down below. Suffice it to say, I really recommend this one. Kind of one of the big guns of science fiction horror to come out in the 20th century. And Richard Matheson, highly, highly influential and talented writer. You're not going to do much better for a post-apocalyptic yarn or a modernized vampire story than this. So, highly recommend that. I just had time, a couple more days left in the month, to polish off a Doc Savage novel. I read The Mystery on the Snow. This one shows number 69 on the Bantam edition, but this was published in 1934, the second year of the Doc Savage pulp run. So I'm guessing this is in the late teens. I didn't quite research deeply which number exactly this is in the Doc Savage series of 182 stories or novels, but this is one of the longer ones, so you can definitely tell it's early. This one is 149 pages of small print in the Bantam edition, and this one's a pretty cracking read. It's The Mystery on the Snow doesn't turn out to be very interesting of a revelation when it does come at the end, but what this one does have is a lot of action, well described, and Lester Dent wrote this one, of course, and it's written very well, and it starts, probably the first half takes place in New York City with this bad guy named Strom and his various minions trying to remove Doc Savage and his men from getting involved in this case of this mysterious man up in Canada called Ben Lane, and eventually the Doc Savage and his 5 aides, all of whom have a lot of fun, good stuff to do in this. Rennie especially gets some good action early on, and then of course Monk and Ham, as always, are in the fray up to their necks, their squabbling necks, in trouble later on. But the last half of the book takes place up in the frozen Arctic wastes of Canada. Kind of involves a syndicate that's trying to stop Ben Lane from bringing this rival kind of chemical compound he's found a rich deposit of that would tank their monopoly, I guess, of manganese. And there's a beautiful French female detective who's involved, private detective, who, of course, despite her feisty nature, falls for Doc Savage. That, as usually happens in these novels, but Monk's there to, kind of dissuade her from that pursuit, because Doc will not respond that way, because he doesn't want to get involved with anyone who, female persuasion that he might care about who could be used against him. Although his men are certainly, his aides are certainly used against him frequently throughout the series, where he has to backtrack and rescue them multiple times, and he does so here several times as well. Although his men are also quite adept at fighting and escapes and etc., and they get their chance to do some of those things as well. Very fun adventure. I would put it in the middle pack of Doc Savage books. It's not outstanding, but it's certainly better than a lot of other ones. It's a rock solid adventure. With some snappy dialogue and some really fun action, and plenty of it. So if you're a fan of Doc Savage, I recommend this one. It's a pretty good shape, my copy here, the Bantam edition. It's got a pretty cool cover. This is not a Bama cover from what I can tell. This looks like maybe a Fred Pfeiffer, perhaps. Not 100% sure. I don't think he's necessarily credited. No credit, but it doesn't look like a Bama to me. Bama is usually a little better with detailed backgrounds. But nice use of color, and Doc's face is rendered well in the same kind of style as Bama was doing. I'll just do, little bit of the blurb on the back that's always on these Bantams. In one of his most important adventures, I don't think so, but anyway, the Man of Bronze journeys north to Canada, and in her magnificent wilderness solves a billion-dollar riddle. Who or what has committed murder, and worse, to possess the secret of the miracle called Benlanium? Of course, named after its discoverer, Ben Lane. Anyway, good pulpy adventure, lots of fun, and it was a good way to round out the month. So that does my reading for May, including Horror Mayhem. I didn't read maybe quite as much horror short stories as I had planned to, although I did polish off quite a few. and certainly read more short horror novels than I expected to, and I read some big guns as far as I'm concerned in that field, with At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft, and I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, plus the novelette or novella Who Goes There by John W. Campbell. Those are ones that I had never gotten around to before, and I'm really glad I did this time. So hope everyone else had a great month of reading as well. Look forward to seeing you in June. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.